Hello, welcome back. In its literal meaning, communism refers to a political system in which the means of production, that just means the facilities which are used for producing goods, the means of production are publicly owned. That means they're not monopolized by somebody else who's making a profit from everything. Also, in a communist society, there is no market and people don't work for a wage. That means they're not compelled to work for somebody else in order to survive, in order to make a living. But that doesn't really tell us very much about how such a society is supposed to be organized or how we're supposed to get to such a society. There have been lots of different ways of thinking about communism. People have had different ideas depending what historical moment they were living through, what country they were living in, and what circumstances they were starting from. I think when we hear the word communism, we often think of a political system which is very authoritarian, characterised by very strict top-down control, and people probably don't have very much control over their own lives. They're probably told by the state where to live and what job they can do. Their salaries are probably very fixed and not very high, and they probably can't go out and buy very much because products in this society are probably supplied by the state and they're all standardized. So this is a society which really isn't characterized by individual autonomy in any way. But if this is all communism is, then it might be quite difficult to understand why so many millions of people all over the world have struggled so hard to achieve a communist society, particularly throughout the 20th century. Communists, for the most part, have been beholden to the ideas of Karl Marx and to rejecting capitalism and to trying to bring about an alternative society to capitalism. But Marx wrote a lot over his lifetime and he was influenced by the ideas of many different people who came before him and also who were in dialogue with him at the time. Therefore, there are many different ways to interpret Marx. So different communists have brought different ideas to the fore and gone off in very different directions as they have tried to put their own understandings of Marx into practice. So here I want to suggest 3 different ways of understanding communism. These are taken from the book The Red Flag by David Priestland. So if you want to know more about this, please do take a look. First, let's talk about what Priestland calls the romantic version of communism. We tend to find references to this more in Marx's early writings. This is characterised by a commitment to individual liberation and self-fulfillment. In the romantic communist vision of society, people don't work for money, so they're not a cog in the machine as people might often feel like in capitalist societies. Instead, work is a way that people express their own creativity and their sense of autonomy. Importantly, in this kind of society, people have control over their own time. That means they have time for contributing to organising communal activities, social activities and also political activities, and to participating in the governance of their own communities. So this kind of society strongly emphasises the importance of grassroots democratic participation and people very often in small communities governing their own affairs for themselves. There's a famous phrase which Marx used, which we can associate with this kind of society. In communist society, society regulates production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner, just as I have a mind. In other words, I can do what I feel like when I feel like it, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd or critic. Now this might all sound quite idealistic, and the fact is that once communist parties came to power, it was generally very difficult to put this kind of ideal society into practice because communist parties coming to power very often face huge amounts of difficulties. They probably came to power in countries which were not very well developed. They might be very poor agrarian societies. And remember, in the Cold War environment of the 20th century, capitalist powers were very hostile to fledgling communist states and did not want them to succeed. So the first thing that communist parties would have to do once they'd come to power was build up their economies as fast as they could. And that's in part to win over the populations, to demonstrate that they could provide people with a better life, and because they needed to build up their militaries as fast as they could in order to withstand external pressure coming from hostile powers on the outside. So at this point, romantic versions of communism tended to take a backseat, and as David Priestland puts it, two other versions of communism tended to really come to the fore at this point. And these he calls the modernist version and the radical version of communism. Now, we can have a discussion about whether the modernist version and the radical version are actually versions of communism, or whether they are a kind of transitional phase put into practice by communist parties as they're trying to move towards the eventual goal of a communist society. But for now, let's go with Priestland's terminologies, because both of these, the modernist version and the radical version, are forms of social and political organisation that we have seen put into practice in regimes where communist parties are ruling. So let's talk about the modernist version first. This is probably what we usually think about when we think of a communist regime. So the modernist version is characterised by strong bureaucratic top-down control. There's a heavy emphasis on centralised planning and bureaucratic control over the economy, because this version of communism is really focused on developing the economy and industry as fast as possible. It's characterised by an ideology of technocratic economic development. And this version of communism tends to take science and scientific expertise very seriously. So policymakers would turn to scientific expertise to provide solutions to policy problems. This is very different from the romantic view of communism, which was characterised not by expertise at the top, but decision-making via grassroots democratic participation, which is really quite different. And also, this kind of communism is characterised by a certain amount of inequality. And the reason for that is, if you need a top strata of well-trained expert technocrats in order to run your economy, they're likely going to be getting certain kinds of privileges, such as higher salaries than other people and probably nicer places to live as well. Again, this is very different from the romantic vision of communism, which very much emphasized equality. And finally, the radical version of communism is again quite different. This one is emphasized by mobilizing the masses with revolutionary fervor, both in order to shore up their support and also to harness their energies for various revolutionary activities. Again, unlike the modernist version of communism, the radical version really emphasizes the importance of equality, because it's the promise of an equal society where people are no longer oppressed or exploited that is one of the ways of mobilizing the masses. And often this revolutionary fervor is pitched against an enemy, again, as a way to mobilize people. So this enemy might be real or at least partially imagined, and it might be an internal enemy, such as a class enemy, like the landlord class, for example, or it might be an external enemy, such as a hostile foreign power that was threatening to invade. In the next few videos, I will talk some more about these different kinds of communism and how they have actually played out in China. Thank you for watching.